Welcome, everyone. So I think what I will do then with the time that we have is take about 30 minutes to outline some of the issues that I think are important in the history of critical theory and relate them then to the kind of contemporary conjuncture, and then open it up for a kind of broad discussion about the stakes of critical theory today and how we might at once understand the history of these traditions and the possibilities for reinventions of critical theory in the contemporary conjuncture. I should say that, as I mentioned before, this is absolutely a work in progress, and so I'm not going to read a paper. I'm going to kind of talk you through the argument. So if there are certain things that interpolate you at various points in time, don't hesitate to jump in and we can begin the conversation earlier. The pre-circulated paper that was available online by Max Horkheimer, I think, is a helpful point of departure for understanding at least the traditional understanding of the history of Frankfurt School critical theory, insofar as one of the central questions for Horkheimer, it's a paper that's published in 1968, obviously in a significant flagship year, is what can theory do? Or perhaps better, what does theory do? And in many ways, the argument that Horkheimer develops, and that would be kind of further developed by Adorno and others within the critical theory tradition of the Frankfurt School, suggests that theory at base can strive for, or potentially contribute to, the transformation of the present socioeconomic order through the overcoming of exploitation and injustice. This is the vocabulary that Horkheimer uses. He often refers to it as the establishment of the quote-unquote right kind of society with self-aware mankind. So there's a notion of a kind of dialectical self-awareness that intellectuals might be able to bring to socioeconomic struggles that could be conducive to various forms of liberation. Horkheimer also correlates this to and makes it akin to a Marxian-style revolution. And I say Marxian and not Marxist, insofar as if you know the work of Horkheimer and Adorno, obviously they're coming out of the Marxist heritage. One of the original names put forth for the Frankfurt Institute was the Institut für Marxismus, or the Marxism Institute. They decided that it might be a bit too dogmatic or straightforward, and instead went for the Institute for Social Research. But this example highlights the centrality of Marxism, but by no means a kind of traditional Marxism. So it's Marxian in the sense that it is akin to certain elements coming out of the Marxist heritage, but wanting to rework them in significant ways, and as I'll argue later on, in quite significant ways, insofar as there's a lot of distance taken from the revolutionary dimensions to the Marxist heritage, already in Horkheimer and Adorno, and then obviously in Habermas and the neo-Habermasians who continue that tradition today. But just to foreground the kind of conceptual armature that's operative not only in this essay, but I think in many ways the essay that Horkheimer wrote sums up a lot of what early critical theory was trying to do. There is an attempt to overcome the limitations of what's referred to as traditional theory. Right? Traditional theory comes about with Descartes, according to their historiography, which I personally find highly problematic, and we could discuss that in greater detail. But traditional theory presupposes a whole series of structural oppositions. And one way of understanding the intellectual intervention of early or first generation critical theory is to try to dialecticize those oppositions. Subject and object are perhaps first and foremost, but also the opposition between thought and being, as well as that between understanding and perception. So subject-object, thought, being, understanding, perception. More generally, if we use the traditional gender-oriented vocabulary, it is man and world. Right? It's mind and external reality. The underlying assumption of traditional theory, then, is that an eternal logos can provide us with universal knowledge concerning the external facts of the world. Right? So that binary operates in such a way that the external world can be perfectly captured by the mind or the logos that maps that world. And one of the major gestures, and this is not only in the restricted critical theory tradition, because they're drawing, obviously, on Marx and other resources, primarily from German philosophy, but elsewhere as well, is to say that, well, the subject of knowledge is always already an object of the social world. So to invert this relationship, instead of there being a subject outside of the world that simply perceives the world and ideally provides the best possible map of that world, it's inserting the subject within the world so that intellectual production itself is understood as the result of social processes instead of that of the kind of individualist invention of creative geniuses, for instance. And it's this dialectical logic that allows them, at least in principle, to overcome these oppositions of not only subject and object, but then also thought and being, in which thought is not something that is just simply abstract and disconnected from the real material world, but instead the product of that real material world. And the same goes for understanding and perception, in which Horkheimer has excellent lines on this. The act of perception is itself an act of judgment. The way we see the world is by carving it up conceptually. Taking a different reference that I quite like, that of Thomas Kuhn. Kuhn says you never see light hitting the retina. All that you see are objects, concepts that are already formatted in such a way that you see a window and a curtain or something like this, because there's a conceptual process that is already operative within perception itself. There'd be a lot to say about this, particularly in relationship to the phenomenology tradition, for those of you familiar with it or coming out of it, because it's also a critique of certain understandings of phenomenology, meaning that it's not just a subject who perceives the world, but the way we perceive the world is always already overdetermined by the way we're socialized as beings within particular worlds. Right? So if you perceive the world in terms of there being black people and white people, for I should say the traditional critical theorists weren't great on the question of race, but if we extrapolate from this, it's that there is not a nature to races. They're not given natural facts. Instead, they're constituted elements of the sensorium or of particular social modes of perception. So we're trained to see white and black, for instance, but also Arab or other skin colors, or for that matter, genders. You could extrapolate this in various ways. And so the argument would be that the way we perceive the world is already a result of our processes of socialization. There's no pure perception. In this sense, then, the critical theoretical term, away from traditional theory, is ultimately an attack on the ontological and epistemological binaries separating mind and world. Or at least this is one way of understanding the core conceptual move. In relationship to this, I think that we can point to this tradition as having been extremely important for rethinking intellectual practice itself as part of a broader and deeper social world. And also refashioning structural binaries like the ones I just mentioned in order to open up not only different venues for thought, but potentially different avenues for action and practice. And there's also an insistence in this tradition of inscribing all of these elements within history, so that there's a historical dynamic and not just a social dynamic. These things have changed over time and will continue to change over time. Hence the relationship to a particular Marxian heritage, which, if in Marx's writings, men are the makers of history, but not in circumstances of their own choosing, what that means is that the ways in which we perceive, think, and act in the world, if they've been produced by a social world, they can potentially be reproduced or reconfigured, right? So that there's no given absolutes that would precondition the way in which we should perceive, think, or act, but instead there's the potential for a reconfiguration of the ways in which we've been fashioned. In this regard, one of the core strategies of critical theory in this traditional sense, then, is that of a self-awareness that is part of a reflexive strategy that, instead of simply presuming that one's thoughts emerge as if from a zero point of creativity, one is always reflecting on the ways in which one's thoughts, actions, and perceptions are formatted by a broader social and historical world. In this regard, it strikes me that critical theory, as invested in self-aware reflexivity, invites and even encourages a kind of critical turn. What I mean by that is that if you take reflexivity and these types of gestures, reflexivity just in the sense that you ask the question of the conditions of possibility of one's knowledge, perception, cultural production, etc., instead of just participating in a particular game of cultural production, knowledge production, and whatnot. If that move is one of the central strategies, then it would seem that it would open space for and even require a kind of critique of critical reason. Meaning, raising the question of how this critical theoretical tradition itself is part of a larger social historical dynamic, and how we might want to understand the history of that critical theoretical trajectory in these broader terms. Meaning a shift away from the way in which a lot of intellectual or philosophic history is often done, and that is you focus on individuals and their ideas, presuming that ideas emerge from these atomistic sites of creativity, and instead think of it in terms of the material, socio-historical, institutionalized structures that produce or favor particular ideas at specific points in time. Now, one of the reasons that I think that that is important is for all of the significant, both conceptual and political work that the early critical theorists did, it's also not only arguable, but I think extremely important to point out the ways in which they were completely disconnected from a whole series of larger global political and intellectual struggles. Edward Said has perhaps most poignantly highlighted the fact that the early Frankfurt School was stunningly silent on racist theory, anti-imperialist resistance, and oppositional practices to empire. Here he's thinking of Adorno and Horkheimer and the kind of central core of the Frankfurt School. You could not classify within this Marcuse, Angela Davis, and a different trajectory to critical theory. And one of the things that I'd like to highlight is the ways in which the very historiography of critical theory itself is not only overladen with, but overdetermined by political states. So the traditional story of critical theory that you get in a contemporary university, and you get it here because I was trained here and know the institution rather well, is that there were 3 generations of the Frankfurt School. There have been 3 generations thus far. Adorno and Horkheimer as the kind of nugget point of the first generation, which I'll return to in a moment, because Marcuse is often held at arm's length. The justification for that is, well, he was teaching in California, and they went back to Frankfurt after the war and things like this. But I think that there's a much deeper reason for that, and that is the radical difference in their politics. But the second generation, which already began with Horkheimer and Adorno, is that of Habermas. And in the case of Habermas, you have Habermas's politics were actually left of Adorno and Horkheimer in the early years, and that's very important to know during the student movement in the 1960s. Horkheimer was much closer to, Habermas was much closer to and in support of the '68 student movement, which overlapped with the student movement here and elsewhere in the world, and that was a movement against capitalism and the ways in which institutions of higher learning simply format subjects for capitalism. That's their role. And so the attack on the university was an attack on the vocationalization of education that produces cogs for capitalist machinery. Habermas early on was actually quite close to and supportive of the students in the very early parts of the movement, but then quite famously accused them of being leftist fascists. And this term stuck, of left fascism. Adorno supported and defended it, the idea being that they used the tactics of fascists because of direct action and university occupation. Habermas, though, as I'm sure you all know, in his political trajectory, moved very far away from the early kind of Marxian lineage and instead became an apologist for a reformist form of constitutional, liberal, modern Western nation states, and inscribes a narrative of modern Western nation states within a kind of very traditional Eurocentric paradigm of modernity and the Enlightenment bringing reason, allowing human beings to emerge from the darkness, and now we need to spread this Enlightenment reason through communicative action around the world. If you know anything about the history of the Enlightenment, it's the history of colonialism, imperialism, mass genocide, patriarchy, on and on and on and on. So that image of the Enlightenment, I could say a lot more about this, but is not simply a straw person, it is a complete myth. But is used then to marshal a certain understanding of reason and reformism as a way of revamping the critical theoretical tradition outside of its Marxian heritage. And so Habermas in many ways is the linchpin for the trajectory of contemporary critical theory, because what's referred to as the third generation, Nancy Fraser, Sheila Ben Habib, Axel Honneth, Rainer Forst, and a number of others, Helmut Rosa, etc., is that they're all neo-Habermasians. They have some, within very restricted confines, critiques of Habermas, but for the most part, they continue the lineage that identifies the critical theoretical project with a reformist modality of liberalism over and against a Marxian heritage that they explicitly and regularly identify as having been exhausted. Right? It's the exhaustion of utopian energies, etc. And then critique in the third generation of critical theory, largely, and this is coming out of Habermas, follows the trajectory of shifting from what Nancy Fraser is famously called a politics of redistribution, a class politics a la Marx, to a politics of recognition, in which politics is about the recognition of minority identities within the structures of governance of contemporary liberalism and the democratic state. The democratic I put in enormous scare quotes. And that this is what the critical theoretical project amounts to at this point in time. Now I should say, of course, particularly in the case of Nancy Fraser, she wants to hold on to a particular type of politics of redistribution, but she has in her most recent debate with Luke Boltanski defended markets and capitalism as being a necessary attribute of any social order. So it's very, very far from resolute Marxist critique of capitalism. It's not anti-capitalist in any resolute sense of the term, like others are resolutely anti-capitalist. Now, one of the reasons that I highlight that and I think is important is because this streamlined trajectory from Adorno and Horkheimer through Habermas to the third generation of critical theory is one of a veer to the right. In the sense that it's a veer away from what's traditionally been defined as the left, and the left is anti-capitalist, and that's how it emerged in many ways, at least in the 19th century left. And that what falls out of this is not only Marcuse, who became the spokesperson for the New Left in many ways, even though he rejected that terminology and that category, because he was resolutely anti-racist, resolutely anti-imperialist, and he has a 800-page FBI file to prove it. They were trying to fire him from the university. He was being tracked at every move because of his prominence for the Black Radical movement, for the Panthers, for the anti-imperialist movement, the anti-war movement, etc., etc. Out of that lineage, you have, of course, people like Angela Davis and others, and that has been completely severed. Marcuse is already liminal because he's too vulgar and unsophisticated, but then the heritage of Marcusean critical theory has been completely severed. And I would encourage you, I'm kind of giving a summary here, but I could go through if you wanted the kind of more boring academic version of this. I can go through all the footnotes that I have on all of these individual authors and the arguments and whatnot. But just one example of this is Rolf Wiggelhaus, who has written the definitive history. It's 788-page history of the Frankfurt School, and its subtitle is its history, theories, and political significance. Doesn't make a single mention of Angela Davis. And then Martin Jay, who has the most well-known book in Anglophone circles on the history of the Frankfurt School critical theory, makes one reference, which is extremely telling, to a black woman who's an outspoken communist. Right? And the reference is this, quote, Marcuse's controversial former student and Communist Party leader. Right? So there's a very clear historiographical delimitation between what counts intellectually as critical theory and what has largely been delegitimated because it's too far left, in short, to be kept within that particular tradition. And I think that this is important because the traditions and histories that we inherit, we often don't see the politics that is inscribed within them precisely because they're naturalized over time. And that when one does call out the particular politics of individual agents or collectives and groups like this, there's often a concern with then instrumentalizing intellectual work, as if you'd have autonomous intellectual work, which would just be critical theory or philosophical work or whatnot, and then its instrumentalization, which would be raising the question of, oh, what were their politics or what were they doing, which of course is dependent upon the liberal ideology of a separation of spheres. You have the intellectual realm, which is where the university works, and then you have the political realm of the street, which is somehow separate, or of governmental bodies, and that these are two distinct things. I think that what we need to understand, or anyone who's serious about understanding intellectual production, has to recognize that intellectual production takes place within material conditions and an institutional network of power relations that is such that politics is always already present. It's just that most of the politics of contemporary institutions is invisible because it's so consensual. And it's that type of politics that washes over oneself like the kind of ideological tidal wave because it doesn't identify itself as political, right? In fact, what it does is it identifies itself as politically neutral and scientific. And there are a million excellent examples of this. This overlaps with the book that I'm currently working on. One great example of it is the reputation of someone like Pierre Bourdieu, the French sociologist, within the EHESS, this institution. Pierre Bourdieu studied under and was the assistant to Raymond Aron, who was born the same year as Jean-Paul Sartre, and they were friends growing up, and then quite famously, Sartre remained a resolute, after the war, towards the end of the Second World War, and moving forward, first a resolute Marxist and then a resolute leftist throughout, right? Complicated relationship to the Communist Party, etc., but a resolute, outspoken leftist, going and meeting with Castro on the world political scene. Aron was having breakfast with Henry Kissinger and other members of the imperial American elite, received direct funding from the American corporatocracy in order to publish and work with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which was discovered in 1966 as a CIA front organization, that ran a whole series of journals where Aron published his work, had his work translated into Japanese and other languages. In fact, the Japanese translation of The Opium of Intellectuals, his famous critique of Marxism, was paid for by the CIA. Aron had as his assistant Pierre Bourdieu, who very early on was not involved in the '68 movement. His politics were much closer to the positivistic, scientistic orientation of Aron, and he knew that he could get funding for doing social scientific work that was anti-Marxist. Anti-Marxist, I should say. I mean, Bourdieu is a complicated figure. It's drifting away from a clear class determinism, where class becomes one factor among other factors in a larger network of social determinants, if you will. And Bourdieu, when in the 1990s he became then more radicalized, which meant defending the welfare state against neoliberalization, one of the resolute critiques of this institution, because I was studying with Bourdieusian sociologists here at that point in time, was that he'd lost his scientific rigor. He was in the streets, and he was defending political causes. And so one of the things I think that's very important to recognize is that it's not that politics is something that you bring to intellectual endeavors. It's that we're always already instrumentalized as intellectuals within a political system of knowledge production. And the real question is, what do you do with that? Do you ignore it and just become a vehicle for the purportedly neutral political framework that is generating the work that you're doing? Or do you try to come to terms with it, push back against it, find leverage and bracing points in order to fight against it? And this brings us back to Marcuse, Horkheimer, and Adorno, because one of the major dividing lines between them is right around the anti-imperialist '68 and broader than 68. I mean, 68 is a kind of term for 60s and 70s global anti-imperialist struggles. And Marcuse aligned himself very clearly in favor of those types of anti-imperialist struggles, whereas Adorno and Horkheimer criticized him resolutely in their correspondence. Adorno has this fantastic quote that I'll read. This is in response to, he's defending Habermas's claim that the student activists were left fascists. And this is in part, I'm sure that you know the famous case of Adorno calling the police on the students when they did an occupation and didn't allow Habermas, Adorno, and another professor to leave. He called the student, but that was only one case among many, many others. If you actually look at Horkheimer and Adorno's political positions, Horkheimer defended the war in Vietnam in order to keep out the Chinese threat. He did that in a lecture that was given at the Amerikahäuser, which were cultural institutes that were set up by the American imperial machine in order to own Western Germany in its fight against communism in the post-war era. Adorno and Horkheimer both defended the British and French invasion of Egypt in 1956 when Israel invaded Sinai. Right? So they, at times, Adorno is very clear about being politically hands-off, but when it comes to things like that, they were very clear about their political positions. What Adorno says in his correspondence with Marcuse is, quote, "To put it bluntly, I think that you are deluding yourself and being unable to go on without participating in the student stunts because of what is occurring in Vietnam or Biafra. You object to Jürgen Habermas's expression left fascism, calling it a contradictio in adjecto, or a contradiction in terms. But you are a dialectician, aren't you? As if such contradictions did not exist, might not a movement, by the force of its imminent antinomies, transform itself into its opposite?" Right? So it's using the logic of dialectics in order to delegitimate the student movement and maintain the position of a kind of what was already in Adorno and Horkheimer, a reformist defense of the German Republic. West Germany. Adorno was also very critical of the students for referring to West Germany as fascist when it was an elected democracy, but we know very clearly from the historical record all of the major parties, including the CDU, which was, they were propped up by and funded by the Americans. They received direct cash payments from the CIA, and the CIA has admitted to this. So the idea that somehow this was just a democratically elected government is historically, it's just not tenable, right? And so in that way, the reason that I point this out is because if we understand political positions as not just those of choosing among a kind of given panoply, but instead understanding how the material conditions within which one operates already overdetermines the political nature of what one's doing. It changes the nature of political games, so to speak, because it requires then a radically self-reflexive awareness of what are the material conditions that are producing you as an intellectual subject, and favoring certain types of intellectual work and creating the conditions by which other types of intellectual work are rendered impossible. What this means then is that one of the things I'm interested in this long arc of the history of critical theory is the taming of the shrew. It's actually a fascinating view into the history of the Western intelligentsia of the last 100 years, because the critical theory tradition began in the interwar period 100 years ago, right at the, it was after the Russian Revolution, and in the interwar period was probably the most globally developed leftist moment in the 20th century. Right? You have the United Front, you have the Popular Front, you have everything that's going on around the world, but in the case of, even if we just focus on Europe, there's a broad consensus coming out of the Great Depression and with the Russian Revolution having happened that capitalism was a destructive force in the world and that we needed to dismantle it. There were different solutions for how to dismantle it, but what is fascinating, given that 100-year history, is that the political trajectory from one of the most resolutely leftist moments in history to our contemporary conjuncture, in which in many ways one could argue that the neoliberal hegemony has destroyed a lot of the material conditions for a kind of anti-capitalist intellectual and cultural production is that the intellectual traditions have followed that lineage, right? So that the shift from a Marxian heritage to a reformist apology for multicultural liberalism, I don't think can simply be tagged onto individual choices by particular intellectuals or by a kind of progress narrative of, oh, these people a long time ago didn't think about race and gender, and they were naive about these things, and now we know about them, and so that we can kind of, the progress narrative of the march of democratic history in which it can be more and more inclusive. If you think that, then you should revisit material history and Clara Zetkin's conversations with Lenin, the fact that the Russian Revolution was, according to all major historians of the Russian Revolution, the most feminist social revolution to date. So the idea that somehow these are, contemporary issues is misguided. And I say that because then what it would invite us to do is to think about intellectual production in this broader social, historical, and institutional sense, and take distance from the ways in which we're then just produced as kind of individuals encouraged to think, work in particular ways. Now, I have a lot of notes on the kind of details of the, how this conversion mechanism operates, meaning conversion from a Marxian-inspired critical theory that's trying to situate subjects within history to a more reformist liberal model in which one becomes simply, in many ways, there's been an outfit in the sense that critical theory is now traditional critical theory. It's become a tradition that is inscribed within institutions of higher education in order to promote the idea that the only political and intellectual, culturally viable solution is liberalism that reforms itself by opening up to broader forms of representation. The attack on capitalism is not part of that. What this, I think, trajectory then suggests, and I've mainly focused quite obviously on the negative critique at this point in time, is that a critique of critical theory, I think, then also requires and necessitates a radicalization of critical theory. And I'm not going to say much about this because I have my eye on the time and I want to kind of open it up, but I'll say a few things. The reason I decided to focus on the critical is to make sure everybody is aware of some of these issues and hopefully generate some powerful discussion, but also because the things I'm going to say just briefly about what I understand as radical theory will hopefully then play themselves out in the coming weeks, meaning that we'll have plenty of examples and instances of marshalling strategies that are an attempt to radicalize critical theory beyond its dormant neoliberal apologies for the contemporary status quo or minor iterations thereof, meaning that if any critical theorist of this school was in the room today, as I've had many, many arguments with them, they would say, no, 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 we're against the system for these reasons. But at the end of the day, if you push them, they're not against the state apparatus and the way in which it functions in direct complicity with the imperatives of global capitalism, meaning global imperialism, right? Meaning the destruction of the biosphere and life as we know it. So in this regard, then, the radicalization of critical theory, as I understand it, would begin, and this is part of what I'm highlighting here, with rethinking this Benjaminian gesture, which is such a wonderful quote where he says that perhaps a revolution is about pulling the emergence brake. And in relationship to the contemporary Aufhebung of traditional critical theory, that's what I would argue. If we want to radicalize critical theory, we need to pull the emergency revolutionary brake on the trajectory that has left aside Angela Davis and his more resolute form of theoretical practice, and do it in such a way that there is that we develop space for not only different types of intellectual practice, but then also different modes of discourse and different ways of relating intellectual work to practical work. Not that these are ultimately distinct in any rigorous sense of the term. Meaning that if we understand the process that I've highlighted as being one that's a political intellectual realignment from say take 1919 or 1918 to 2018, what we've seen is a political intellectual realignment. And that is a redefinition of politics in terms of the hard left being lobbed off, at least by consensual politics and the mass media, and the left now being liberalism, when liberalism was never the left. I mean, liberalism is in favor of the state and capitalism, and it is the intellectual project that brought us such wonders as global colonialism and imperialism. And these weren't contradictions. If you know the work of Domenico Losurdo on the counter-history of liberalism, these were inscribed within the project itself. The major thinkers of liberalism are the major thinkers of imperialism. John Locke wrote, it's in his hand, the Constitution of South Carolina, in which slavery is inscribed within it. That project itself is not the left as it was understood traditionally in the 19th century, right? So if there's been a historical realignment, I would say that one of the aspects of radicalizing critical theory is at once understanding that project of realignment and trying to develop as much as possible leverage points, counter institutions, and counter practices for reconfiguring that realignment so that there can actually be institutional space and support for the type of resolute anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist, anti-colonial work that has been cut off from this particular tradition. And I think there's a lot of different ways of doing that. One is the central importance of understanding how intellectual production operates. That's why I've highlighted a lot of what we've talked about thus far. And thinking about intellectual production in terms of, in many ways, a choice between being an instrumentalized intellectual, which we all are. As long as you're trained in any way, shape, or form, it can just be by society, even not trained in an institution. You're an instrumentalized intellectual. Versus something like an interventionist intellectual. And an interventionist intellectual would understand and come to terms with the formatting that produces particular modes of intellectual subjectivity, but then also attempt to reconfigure how those modes of intellectual work are produced, meaning they would attempt to intervene within the force field of power relations so that the gesture of intellectual work is not simply describing or diagnosing, or for that matter, discursively intervening, but actually materially and collectively attempting to seize the intellectual means of production, circulation, and reception. Because that's what the corporate powers now generally own. And so an interventionist, the project of being an interventionist intellectual is not an individual project. It's not a purely discursive project. It is one of trying to harness one's own intellectual and cultural power in order to collectively work with others in order to establish alternative communities, new institutions that begin to push back as much as possible and create space for and leverage points and bracing points for a different mode of intellectual production, circulation, and reception. And I think that that type of project, in many ways, in spite of all of the critical things that I've said, segues with, and this is the last thing that I'll say, we'll kind of open up here, with some of the things that the early Frankfurt School was attempting to do. They were bringing together intellectuals from a number of different disciplines, traditions, cultural heritages, in order to do collective work to develop an understanding of contemporary, in that time, social society in its totality, right, in all of its different dimensions, but not simply for the reasons of diagnosis. A doctor who would simply give you a diagnosis and then just be like, yeah, you're really sick and you're probably going to die, isn't as helpful as a doctor who would say, well, you're really sick, you're probably going to die at some point, you will die at some point, but here are some things that might allow you to prolong that process or change that process in various ways. And so I think that project of the early critical theory was a very important moment historically for attempting to do some of these things. And so there are other important flashpoints that we can latch onto. The Black Panthers come to mind, the American Indian movement, there are a lot of other examples. But given the credibility of critical theory within the contemporary academy, it's also a kind of easy reference point that is legible to those who work within the academy. So I think I'll stop there. Questions, comments, criticisms, rebuttals, frustrations, or really trendy, attempts to highlight something that no one else knows.
I have a fun fact, which you mentioned Claire Zetkin, and another really cool thing that she did was during the Scottsboro Boys trial, she toured Europe and gave speeches all over the place, to raise support and solidarity for the Scottsboro Boys. So, yeah, cool anti-racist work out of Bolsheviks.
Yeah. Yeah, maybe everybody just say their first name first, so that we can all familiarize ourselves. Alejandro, right?
Yeah. Okay, got it. I have two comments meant to stir the pot a little. I'm not actually being critical. Well, so the first thing that I found interesting is that you argued that neoliberalism has eroded the conditions for left intellectual production, or something to that effect, in our modern moment. And yet, I think it's, and then later on in the lecture, you mentioned that sort of the hard left has been pushed out of the mainstream political spectrum, such that we have liberalism acting as the left, and the right being something else now. I think that's a particularly interesting statement to make now, right, given that formerly, particularly in the United States, the right wing would have been liberal, right? Say George H.W. Bush was classically liberal, but Bush Sr. and even to some degree George W. Bush, right? And even here and then on the right, in the current moment, you have the emergence of fascism, right? Even in the United States and in Europe. And so I find that there are elements to, and this is the stir the pot thing, I find that there are elements to fascism that are in some ways responding to popular discontent in ways in which the hard left also attempts to respond to popular discontent. So a short way of saying that would be that given that to some degree the policy prescriptions of, say, Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump in the United States, or even, Marine Le Pen and Hollande to some degree dovetail, right? That we might be at this moment seeing a populist resurgence that actually could create conditions for reclaiming the intellectual modes of production, as you say.
How?
How? Well, I saw, for instance, that the first part of the Horkheimer article that we read for today. Was meant to dealt with propositions and facts at their most basic level as being the building blocks of how you test theory. I think, at least in the United States, it is that we can very clearly, well, at least in my opinion, although I do open up the how for others, I think you clearly see a rejection of sort of facts and hegemonic knowledge and authoritatively sanctioned knowledge production. And I think at the moment at which a person begins to reject authoritatively produced knowledge and authoritatively produced factoids, one opens up space.
I see what you mean. Yeah. I would say a few things. One is that my understanding of the current conjuncture is rooted in a kind of deeply historical account of the evolution of liberalism and the emergence of fascism. And so by liberalism, I don't mean liberal as an ideology. I mean the mode of political governance based on the idea that you would establish a quote-unquote neutral state apparatus that would be the guarantor for a set of inalienable rights of individuals, and it would also protect those rights through a monopoly on violence.
Right.
In that sense, then, political liberalism is the system within which you have in the United States liberals, conservatives, fascists, etc. There are certain extreme, it depends on the type of fascism that we're talking about, so I can just leave that aside. But the system as it operates of quote-unquote constitutional law, which is not a democracy. The United States was not founded as a democracy. It was never changed into a democracy. The entire material, institutional, and discursive history of the United States is crystal clear. What isn't clear is the ideological obfuscation that began in 1830 and continued today, and that is that the Founding Fathers set up a democracy. They were hostile to democracy. They said it repeatedly. It was a form of mob rule, giving power to the uneducated members of the population, meaning the poor. In that sense, then, liberalism as it's set up is a form of elite rule. It's an oligarchy, where you have those who have the power, meaning the leisure time usually to be educated, to rule over all others. And liberalism has, of course, historically emerged hand in hand with these are slow processes and they emerge metastatically, but with capitalism. And so in that regard, I would say that the current conjuncture needs to be understood in that broad history of political liberalism. And what we do have is what's referred to as this kind of resurgence of fascism. I don't particularly like the language of resurgence, just insofar as fascism historically, of course, emerged in the interwar period as a way of governing a body politic under threat of anti-capitalism. And that's how it was developed in Italy with the black shirts, is that there were workers organizing, unions, resolute Marxists, the possible seizure of state power in the wake of the Russian Revolution. What do? You get the corporate elite to mobilize the populace in order to have them come in, break up strikes, beat people up, etc. You see this, I mean, this is what happened it happens in France with the occupations. The fascists who are brought in to do the dirty work of the kind of corporate elite. And that mode of governance is, I mean, it's historically dated in the sense that the term fascism emerged then. But as Aimé Césaire famously pointed out, said that, well, the world didn't wait for European fascism. This mode of governance has been the mode of colonial governance from the beginning of colonialism. And what it is that you usually, depends on the particular form, but usually you have a corporate elite that hires some poor people to kill some other poor people. Poor, it might be a relative term, it might be middle-class cops or whatnot, but in any case, that's the structural power relation. And the question of populism, I think we have to be very, very careful in this regard, because it often segues with a certain myth surrounding administered democracies. Administered democracies are not popular rule. What we have in the contemporary world is a kind of 60-second democracy at best, in which, as Marx said, once every 4 or 5 years you have the right to go to the urns for 60 seconds and select the member of the oppressing class who's going to oppress you for the next 4 or 5 years. And that's how the system operates. And the populist aspect, I often find, is trying to blame fascist-style leaders on the working class. If you look at the Trump phenomenon, for instance, he was polling at zilch in the primaries. The entire primary system is set up so that you can have these type of phenomena emerge. He was receiving, I don't have the stats in mind, but I've written on this, it was about only 10% of registered Republicans were voting in the primaries, of which only about 3% were voting for Trump in many of the primaries. So this is like a speck of a speck of a speck of dust when it comes to the population. What produced the Trump phenomenon? Well, the corporate mass media complex and all of the mechanisms that go into that, like so many other forms of quote-unquote populism have developed, at a moment at which it is extremely conducive, particularly because you do have a harder left pushback now than you did when, for instance, in the 1990s when I was in college or school. And so and also, you know, neoliberal capitalism is literally running out of oxygen, right, because of all the pollution in the environment. And so on its heels, what does it do? Well, there's a need for these types of draconian authoritarian modes of leadership, because fascism and liberalism, as I want to understand them, they're two modes of governance. Liberalism is the mode of governance for the placated members of the middle and upper classes, or the aspiring poor classes who want to believe in the American dream. Fascism is the ongoing and constant mode of governance for poor folk around the world, and for those who push back against capitalism. And if you don't know that, you can find it out very quickly by pushing back hard against capitalism and finding out what happens. And so I actually think that the way we have to understand the history of liberalism, sorry this is so long, but I'm actually writing a paper on liberalism and fascism can't be understood as opposites. This is the myth that was produced coming out of the Second World War, right? The people who fought the fascists in Europe were the communists and the anarchists, and those who were against corporate-style fascist capitalism. That's just a historical fact. The United States was not in support of Franco. They didn't get in. They could have been against Hitler earlier. They were not. They could have been against Mussolini earlier. They were not. They were kind of pushed into the war, and then they generated this myth of liberalism as the last bulwark against fascism. And fascism is linked under the ideological concept of totalitarianism with communism. They're the same thing. They're both the enemy. I think that against this ideological formatting, what we need to understand is liberalism and fascism are two modes of governance that function in complicity with one another, but that are constantly trying to convince the general population that they're different, because the way they operate is that liberalism is the good cop that's going to tell you, you have rights, I'm going to protect you, the state is here for you, etc. Fascism is the bad cop. If you don't follow the good cop, they're going to bring the bad cop in, going to beat you up, throw you in jail, etc. And that they operate not as polar opposites, but as a form of complicity for governing under administered democracies.
Can I have a follow-up?
Yeah, of course. Sorry that was so long, but
No,
it's...
that was great. So the follow-up question would be, you don't think, or you don't find it at all relevant, say that over time, the mode of governance, the apparatus that is liberalism, has also developed to self-describe, right? To the degree that an inanimate object can self-describe, right? To the degree that a non-subject can describe itself as not a sort of form of mob rule, right? But rather as an egalitarian system to which we can all kind of aspire to be included into. That technology and that ability to evolve.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
Well, that's how liberalism presents itself, of course.
Right.
But because what it does is it's a form of theodicy of sorts, which is very powerful, because what it does is it says that the idea of an all-inclusive democracy in which everyone has rights is so powerful that regardless of what actually happens in the real world, in which people don't have rights, there's mass incarceration, mass poverty, etc., these are all just minor hindrances in this teleological progress narrative leading to the possible halcyon idea of a democracy to come, right? And that's precisely one of the ways in which liberal ideology keeps people ensnared within it. Because if you look at the material history of liberalism, there is no, I think, defensible argument from somebody who knows the corpus and knows the material history that can be made that there has been progress in that way. The rights given to one group, taken away from another. Or often with, for instance, the voting rights for African Americans is a great example, because it was a political ploy, right, on the part of the party structure. It's the same with a lot of the gerrymandering that goes on, other rights, etc. And so that narrative, I think we need to always compare to the opposite narrative. And that is that the standard mode of analysis of Marxism today is that, well, it was good in theory, but it failed in practice, right? That's the best that you can possibly get, right? But notice the opposite. relationship between theory and practice here. In the case of Marxism, it's that the practice failed, therefore the idea forever collapses from the horizon of possibility. In the case of liberalism, it's that, well, the practice might be kind of bad, but the idea shines its bright light eternal for all time. So the very relationship between theory and practice is inverted, which reveals as well, a la Marx and Engels' famous analysis of the camera obscura of ideology, that the world is upside down from these two vantage points. If we want to take liberalism seriously, which I think we should do, let's analyze its material history and look at what it's actually done in the world and continues to do in the world. And then we can bracket this whole nonsense discussion about an idea of something to come that, well, you know, I like, Badiou has this great line about it's a critique of Derrida's notion of democracy to come. He's like, well, if it's always to come, then why don't you come back and tell me about it when it shows up, because in the meantime, I've got work to do. I mean, obviously, it's a kind of sardonic statement on his part, but the idea of some idea to come sounds very metaphysical and very otherworldly, rather than actually looking at what it does now.
So, two things. So, I'm a bit weary about the use of the word populism, because it seems to be, for me, a complete misnomer of what's actually happening. It seems more like liberalism using the stick on itself, to some extent.
Liberalism using?
The stick on itself, in part, and on partly more radical movements. And then the other thing is, if we go with that historiography, which I'm sympathetic to, is that we also have to acknowledge the complete failure of the left, or at least of the organized left. Not sure if it's completely comparable to sort of the left as a body of ideas, or as a body of discourse, to organize properly. And we have, well, for one, a complete disavowal of Marxism, right? It's coming back now a little in the US, but very slowly. We have failures of movements such as Occupy or others, which failed mostly to, for instance, issues of organization. So there is a complete failure of the left to seize the means that are given by liberalism, or to somehow subvert them in terms of intervention or in terms of transformation, which leads me to, for instance, think of Mélenchon, who doesn't use the word left anymore. He stopped using it because he doesn't think it's a paradigm. Then we can look at forms of protest or forms of organization and question whether they are the relevant forms to really transform society, or to really bring about a political change. So the question of the masses is one of them here. So do we still have the same forms of masses to organize as we had, for instance, in the way Kennedy described, or others? So there's at once, in some sense, the extension of liberalism as the space in which politics takes place today, and Bernie Sanders is in it. Trump is in it as well. That's why I'm sort of, against the term populism, as well as the failure of the left in some sense to organize against this. And here we can come back to Marx in some sense, that in his analysis of capitalism, or of the modes of organization, he somewhat saw a window for seizing an opportunity to transform society. And so there's in some sense a recognition involved, not the kind of recognition of Honneth, which, is in my opinion completely complacent with colonialism, because there's forms of colonialism in which recognition takes place, but you can still kill the other, even if you perfectly recognize him on paper. So I think this history of critical theory has to be enriched with, in some sense, the history of the failure of the left, but also the disappearance of the memory of the left, for instance, in the US, in which, McCarthyism has pretty much eradicated traces of radical politics that were there in the 20s.
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting. I have an approach to kind of political and cultural history that always presupposes a multi-agential account of social relations, in the sense that if history is not simply the relationship between two or three forces, but actually an extremely dense force field of relations, then it's very difficult to say, and I would be reticent, maybe this is semantic, but for me it's an important point, to say something like the failure of the left or the success of the right, or, I mean, it sounds like a kind of world historical pronouncement. The reason I say that is that there is so much that has happened over these last 100, 200 years that is quintessentially important. One person who makes this argument, and I'm not certain that I completely agree with it, but I think it's a fascinating argument to think about and grapple with, is Cornelius Castoriadis, who claims that the only way that global capitalism survives, right, because global capitalism wants to destroy life and make surplus value. Right? I mean, that's its goal. It doesn't matter if there's life there. What matters is surplus value. And so, in principle, it is a self-destructive system. That's how it operates. And what Castoriadis claims is that the only reason that capitalism has been able to perpetuate itself is because there's constant pushback at a million different levels. And so it's like a death machine that is kept alive precisely because those who it's trying to destroy are not allowing themselves to be constantly destroyed. And this can be at many, many different levels, right? At the level of individual alienated labor, it can be at the level of organizing, etc. Now that's a kind of, I think, for me, important proviso, but it doesn't mean that I disagree with some of the larger issues, and that is the organizational question of, I don't think we can simply say, oh, well, there were these, we just should resuscitate the First International and, you know, be off to the races with the proletarians, etc. I think that one of the reasons we have to understand that material history and its multi-agential configuration is precisely so that we can find resources across a very broad spectrum. Radical anti-colonial struggles, anti-capitalist feminism, anti-capitalist queer politics, and there's a lot that has gone on, and I agree that a lot of those memories have not only been stultified, but they've been destroyed in the academy, because it's not only McCarthy, it is the broader intellectual apparatus is pitted against having those memories retained, so that when you study political science or political theory, for instance, a lot of these things are made secondary or liminal in various ways, and the intellectuals of these traditions don't occupy positions of power, right? The Black Panthers, what if they were all, you know, given university positions? Instead of that, we have liberals who defend the politics of recognition and tell a kind of progress narrative. So these are very, very different traditions and modes of relation. So all of that to say, like, what I really agree with is the call to organizational arms, right? That a big question today is, how can people organize? I don't think there's a simple answer to this. I don't think there's a single blueprint. I think there's a lot of fascinating things, and I kind of wish, I think most people, other than you, are younger than me here. It'd be really exciting to be in your generation, because your or the younger generation, like 15, 20 years younger than me, it's exciting, much more exciting than the doldrums. I was like, in a wasteland. And there's a lot going on today that is producing possibilities that I think need to be tapped into, and these organizational questions need to be pushed forward.
So about my name is Raya, and this fatigue you talked about from the first generation to the third generation, I'm kind of sympathetic to, not the outcome of it, but the fatigue itself. Because we all think about interventionist approaches to theory and how we can come up with a revolutionary outcome, but
do we?
Yeah, we do. I mean, at least at AUB, at the American University of Beirut, where I am, we constantly think of this.
Okay, I gotta go there.
We constantly do this reflexive exercise, but we always fall back into two things: ideology, Zizeklian anti-Syrian ideology, and the moral neoliberal, which you introduced right now. A concept that says that movements like EHESS, for example, or Occupy, end up reproducing capitalism because their demands end up being liberal in a sense, because they ask for egalitarianism, equality, universalism, which are concepts that derive from neoliberal capitalism. So, and this is where some critical theorists become cynical and others become apologetic and reformist, because they don't see a way out of the system. Because what we're asking for is something, or at least what I think I'm asking for, is something that is produced by the system itself. So the demands at the end up reproducing the system itself.
Yeah.
So because capitalism is an automaton at the end of the day, it reproduces itself. So any discussion I've had with other critical theorists in class, the answer is always, but when you do this, you end up reproducing. because of this moral neoliberal subject that we've become inevitably, because we're a product of our social context. If you think about politics in that sense, it's very depressing. So I really want to be
Timur's going to enlighten us, I think.
Oh,
right?
yeah. So,
or did you have, I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you have something
I
else?
just think it's all coming from a good place because I'm frustrated as well. Because at the end of the day, we do want an intervention. I do want an intervention. But every time I try to come up with something, or we think about things like the EHESS movement, for example, people say, well, yeah, look at the demands, look at what they're asking for. They want to be part of the system at the end of the day. So what good is that going to do?
yeah, I really like that. I think that this is like such a huge, like important, like one of the most important things to think about. And like people usually, or like a lot of times there's kind of this distinction between like reformist and revolutionary movements. And I think it's very worth kind of not being so strict about this and being concerned more with like the way in which particular demands are pursued. So like Kwame Ture has this, like a bunch of lectures about the kind of like the difference between mobilization and organization. Kwame Ture is Stokely Carmichael, where like mobilization is sort of like transient. It's like temporally bounded, I guess we could say. And so like, for instance, with BDS or something, like you can organize a demonstration and successfully get, I don't know, like for instance, like the Philadelphia Symphony is like touring Israel right now, and there was like a lot of effort to like call attention to that. It's like, so you can kind of pursue these demands in a way so that like the demands themselves are like the final end of what you're doing. So that's kind of like a mobilization. And it's like, there's no institutional memory involved. Like the individual people involved might like learn something about how to organize, but they're not necessarily like, I guess, so this is when you kind of come to organization. This is like sort of the flip side. So like, I guess what I would say is like you can pursue these demands in a way that's more like a mobilizing, kind of like one shot type thing. But then on the other hand, like if you have sort of like an organization and you're building your organization through pursuing these demands, that's kind of like a different thing, because like a revolutionary organization, for instance, like insofar as it remains revolutionary, which it's possible to like kind of pursue these like short-term demands and still like have a sort of revolutionary horizon, then you're pursuing these demands like, yes, because it's important to like win whatever concession you're trying to win, but also because you're like sort of building up this like the experience of your organization. Like you're talking about kind of like this need to have like institutional memory and like learn from our lessons, all the like sort of experiences that were erased like during the doldrums of the 90s. But yeah, just to say like, I think it's like a really important tactical question in a way, because it's like, then the question becomes like, oh, not so much about like what demand can we formulate, because like, for instance, if you like go out into like a working class community and your demand is like revolution right now, everyone's gonna be like, that's like doesn't really speak to like my experience or whatever. But if you're like, hey, like I'm a member of this like revolutionary organization and we're like fighting to stop this like eviction from happening or something, then it's like sort of more of an instance to say like, this is why we're doing this. We're not just about stopping one eviction. We're about like stopping evictions, like period, and building a society in which like everyone has housing, like etc. So yeah, it's sort of like, I think worth trying to think about it in like tactical or like strategic terms and say like, because in the end, like at least in my experience, like when you're formulating a demand to pursue like in a sort of like organized way, there's this, the main concern for us has always been like, how can we come up with something that's like big enough that people will be like, oh yeah, I want that. That's like inspiring to fight for this, but also not so big that it's like people will feel like it's impossible, like you can never achieve it, so they don't want to like even begin organizing in the first place. So yeah, that's kind of a piece, but that's like really important question to think about.
Brett, did you want to speak to this too? Because I don't want to.
No, I have just
something else.
pop-up, so
Maybe I'll just tag something on quickly, because I do think that there's a very widespread discourse that I generally tend to find amongst people that I would qualify as academic Marxists, meaning, and I would identify Adorno and Horkheimer as academic Marxists, but with the insistence on academic, meaning that There's a recognition of the arrival at an epistemological utopia that far supersedes any political utopia, meaning that they always already know that everything is destined to fail because the tentacles of capitalism are everywhere, and anything that you do is recuperated. That often has more to say about occupying a particular social position of an all-knowing member of the academy who then is justified in not doing anything because they already know that the very act of doing anything will be quote-unquote recuperated. So I find that the position itself is dubious from a political point of view, because it doesn't matter if you're an activist, like a militant activist or not, you're a political agent, and you're doing things with your agency, just by inhabiting the world. And so I think that one has to recognize that. I think it's also important that recuperation is not a unidimensional phenomenon. If you think of a book like Capital, it was written, circulated, people made money off of that book. People sell it on Amazon. But that book is also a kind of bomb of sorts because it carries with it an analysis of contemporary, or of, in the 19th century, capitalist power relations. In that sense then, let's not give the enemy too much power and say, oh, they're everywhere, we can't do anything. All that we can do is endlessly describe how confined we are by the tentacles that encircle us. Instead, let's say that, well, we can use the interstices within this system in order to generate powerful movements that are tactically anchored in various ways, but that have a strategic kind of horizons, something that is far beyond the contemporary world. Because it's also, I think, an illusion to think that you could have, and this is also a somewhat widespread position, that you can have the kind of purity of a political experience that is completely unadulterated by any technological or political or economic apparatus. Like, to drink water, I have to get it somewhere, otherwise I would die, and in the system that we work within, that water emerges only from certain sources. And so in that sense, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden all of my agency is recuperated. It means that I'm an agent working within a larger constellation of agencies and trying to find space within that to do interesting things. And finally, with Timur, I couldn't agree more that one of the most important things is connecting with other agencies. Because then you can mobilize in such a way that you can produce space in which it's not just you doing something, but a collective ethos, a movement, and institutions, and things like this that actually have weight that far supersedes the aggregate of its component parts. That's why collectivities are so interesting and I think important. I don't know if anybody wants to jump in. I don't want to monopolize the conversation. So on this topic or on something else?
On this topic and on something else.
Yeah. Okay, perfect.
I think that if we want to make this kind of illumination of material conditions of our intellectual productions, we have to work not only in an institutional or communitarian level, but also in a personal level. And I think that phenomenology could give us lots of sources for making that. I think that always when we relate to the world in a traditional way, and we make some statements that we consider like established, we can put these statements in, or take these statements in a critical way. And that is a personal attitude. That is what phenomenology gives us, the personal attitude of making critical, or being critical of our personal statements. And if we make that, and for example, I don't know, aesthetics can help us for that, we can also make some changes in a communitarian and in an institutional level and in an intellectual level. But I think that we have to work in all levels. And that's why, that is the other subject, I think that phenomenology was a big source, epistemological source for the first generation, but I think that is also a great source for the fourth generation. For example, the concept of ideology of Selicates and Rael Jegi implies the concept of ideology of Paul Ricoeur, that is phenomenological, and the concept of world disclosure of comparatives also has lots of supposition of Heideggerian thought. And I think that critical theory right now is starting of seeing these primitive levels of our configuration, epistemological configuration, and the relation of it to the social world.
Yeah.
But we can't make more of this in order to develop another kind of radical theory, radical critical theory.
Right. No, I think that's a good point. I mean, the phenomenological tradition is, of course, very complex, and there's a lot that goes into it. And so it would be interesting to kind of take some of the things that I've put out here in the broad, like, last 100 years of critical theory and relate it to the phenomenological tradition. Because, of course, you have Nazi philosophers, you have Habermas, who's himself a member of the Hitler Youth, which is important to remember. And so phenomenology is also, just like critical theory, it's a discourse that can lend itself to different types of practices. And I think that is, I think it's just important to identify where there's at once resources, at times very important resources, but then also that no tradition is necessarily inoculated against politics that, at least in my case, I would find highly problematic. And I can think of other examples, like Levinas's stance on gender relations or on the Arab question or things like this, I find not only highly problematic, but like politically retrograde. So that is basically that I agree, but want to think about both resources and potential limitations. Brendan, I think you want to jump in.
Yeah, I wanted to return to the point of kind of liberal progress narrative and the great irony in it, because it's very much unlike kind of Habermasian politics of recognition we all get together to discuss and get to a good point. Any sort of progress that was made under liberal governance, for the most part, was the result of class antagonism or an antagonism of another marginalized group. The reason why we aren't living in the Dickensian capitalism of Marx and Engels is because workers fought against agencies like the National Guard or the Pinkertons under threat of having their children burned alive or being bombed. And more recent movements like the Civil Rights Movement were massive movements against state agents that fought against it. And often the overcoming was by means of these movements taking liberal governance, kicking and screaming into any sort of form of progress. So the question isn't whether antagonism works, it's the material conditions which makes whatever form of antagonism effective.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And it's also, I mean, it's interesting to see how the rights discourse in the history of liberalism operates, because it often also has functioned. Jennifer Ponce-de-Leon, who's going to come into the workshop later, has done a lot of work on this, in order to siphon off the more radical parts of social and cultural movements. And I mean, you see this in the phenomenon of how a movement relates to a representational party. Right? We saw this with Podemos, you saw it in Greece, we've seen it elsewhere, the Bernie Sanders phenomenon as well, where some people at least will want to correlate it to, there were a bunch of people in Occupy, they were looking for someone else, and Sanders kind of filled that role. And that at times then you have the liberal edifice, which is political reality, right? It's what is possible. Then siphons off these more radical movements, often picking up on their leadership, integrating them in various ways, and then ideally, from their point of view, destroying the movement itself, and inscribing that destruction of the movement within a liberal progress narrative, which is, well, there was this movement that wanted these things, and now look, we have them. The civil rights movement, as it's called in the United States, is an excellent example thereof, given the standard historiography. It's about charismatic church leaders from the South who nonviolently requested that the state apparatus give them rights. Well, they had rights, you know, rights to segregation. Those were rights. That's how they operated. Rights to separate but equal institutions. It's not as if the notion of rights doesn't have content. The thing is that people forget that rights do have content, and then what you do is you cut that off from all of the radical black organizing that was going on at that point in time. That was also anti-imperial, anti-capitalist, etc. In order to tell this very, very simple story and say, hey, look, we succeeded because blacks can vote now, right? And that's a lot of how that narrative operates. Meanwhile, mass incarceration, massive poverty, the ghettoization of African-American communities just continues unabated. Which is an interesting way of, when you plug into how the magicians of history operate, it's interesting to see kind of behind the curtain and realize that, oh, all those things that I heard about when I was in school, if you were educated in the United States, about Martin Luther King, and they cut out all of his organizing against Vietnam and poverty and workers' rights and the fact that the FBI was involved in his assassination. I usually don't mention that because it's not a really important fact, In that regard, I think that those narratives, they function at many, many different levels. How do you want to jump in on this?
I think, and I really enjoy finding kind of these types of classes because I think it keeps it interesting. But I was wondering with regards to sort of the liberal progress narrative. I think it's interesting because I would prefer the liberal progress narrative rather as a material zenith that you can kind of locate, at least in my head, in the 1950s, right, or in the 1960s, actually in mid-century, right, where by subscribing to sort of, the discipline of the bell and the discipline of the alarm clock and the discipline of all of these things, you will attain this standard of living, right, wherein you will be able to have sort of 2.5 kids and a nice white picket fence house and these, and an SUV. And I wonder if I think very accurately called kind of the fatigue of the left is because the left is so unable, I think, in my opinion, and this is another statement that I'm using half-heartedly agree with, but I think it's somewhat accurate, that the left is unable to sell a package that is quite as vivid and as appealing in the imagery of the collective, right? So, say, if we go back to, anyone you have your name?
Me?
Yeah. Sorry?
Timur.
Timur, okay. So, Timur gave an example of mobilization, and I often wonder if the left so often fails because it is forced into creating either very ambiguous kind of long-term goals of a communism to come or a socialist utopia to come, on the one hand, and then short-term goals on the other, like say we're going to try to stop all evictions, or we're going to try to raise the minimum wage to $50, or so on and so forth, whereas liberalism itself, I think, is able to, liberalism both as a political economy, as a free market system, and even as as a political economy, is so compellingly able to offer a vision of material welfare.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that you're saying that liberalism that the sort of difference is this offered package, and I think that maybe one way of thinking about this package that liberalism offers is a particular relevance in a positionality in a particular economy. So you can, I don't know, I actually don't really want to spend a lot of time cashing out the liberal package, but what I'm thinking about is Timur's point and what mobilization efforts, a way that we could think of mobilization efforts also in terms of the way, paying, and ones that I'm interested in, pay a critical attention to the positionalities that they're mobilizing. So a group that's interested in calling out evictions is probably going to be speaking to people who are who are tenants, and is asking tenants to mobilize qua tenants using a particular structure in which they're involved, in which they're participating. And, you know, I mean, this, I think it, you know, yeah, so I mean, this speaks back to your point as well about, you know, visions getting co-opted and how no sort of vision that you put forward is not going to be co-opted into capitalism. And it's like, well, what if, you know, I mean, in terms of graduate student unionizing, like you know, we're speaking to the university as people who are paid, as employees. I mean, that's a movement that operates a particular, you know, mobilizes a particular positionality, and also uses the proffered identifications, like say a term like intellectual community, our university community, our academic community, and then points to members of that community. You know, we had a student who was shot by our university police force a few weeks ago, and was shot because they were living far enough off campus that they weren't considered a part of the community. So they were having like a sort of, you know, mental breakdown, and so their psychotic episode was considered not a community problem. You know, and I think that there's a lot to be said in terms, you know, for, you know, a critical project in relation to mobilization, and also, you know, turning back in relation to what the package being offered is. You know, just in terms of you know, what are the ways in which you or a mass or a collective are being interpolated or sort of called forth and used by different structures, and in what ways can they be sort of used for something else? Yeah.
I think it's important. You want to jump in? Yeah.
I was thinking about what Timur said before. I wanted to formulate a proper devil's advocate response, because I keep thinking about these things. So I thought about Robert Heister and temporality. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He has a book called After Evil. And he talks about temporality in the sense of messianic time versus prophetic time. And he says that the struggle for justice is always a struggle in waiting in neoliberal capitalism. Because we're constantly waiting for justice to happen. If not tomorrow, the day after. It's never going to happen now. While prophetic time, so messianic time is the Judeo-Christian tradition. And prophetic time is the Islamic tradition, where justice has to be taken in hand right now. And this struggle with temporality is a very relevant struggle, I find, because of this mobilization that you were talking about. We start now, but it will happen later. And this is also something that is very reproductive of the status quo, because the state tells people, we will give you reparations, but you will receive justice after. And I think that this book is very important to be read. He took 20 years to write it, so I think it's worthwhile book to read. And about the semantics that you were talking about, the words that we use, community and intellectual community and stuff like that. Beato Zek talks about this, and Mannenheim talks about this, about how we're constantly in the realm of ideology because of the words that we use, and because of the fact that we partake in the system by paying money in itself, by being interpolated as an ideological subject when answering while we're healed. These are also things that we need to consider and think about when we think about an intervention or being an intellectual interventionist.
Well, ideology and sorry, and like, you know, in relation to participating in particular structural. Yeah.
Do you want to respond for you?
Yeah, that's really interesting for sure to think about. I just wanted to clarify one thing about what I said earlier, which is this like mobilization and organization, at least for like Pointry, mobilization is like no bad, and organization is like the good thing where you're building an organization. Just to, I don't know if that was like totally clear in how I said it, but yeah. The messianic time thing I usually like, that makes me think about is like, I can't remember the exact name for the concept, but like, sometimes people think about like revolutions as like more of an event where it's like this, okay, now we're like in the pre-revolutionary time, and then there's a revolution, and then the sort of construction of like, for instance, like a socialist state would be like the post-revolutionary time. But like for instance, in Cuba, like they just celebrated 60 years of the revolution. So they consider the revolution to be like ongoing in this way. And like I said, I can't remember the exact name, but there's some kind of concept in like kind of early 20th century socialist thought where it's like this kind of idea that like in the moment, like you can be acting in like either a revolutionary or like a counter-revolutionary way, and that it's like not so much this like huge climax of like everything like coming to fruition, but like that like actually small things, like maybe the way that you like regard something, you know, like you can kind of act like in a more or less revolutionary way also like in the present. I don't know if that really exactly like
No,
speaks to what you're.
I understand your book, and there's a book by Andrea Molleva, who's Italian, writes about Italy and socialism and about the moral neoliberalism, and talks precisely about these things. The fact that we think about small things and not big things, while the break in 1990 was the fall of the communist world was a huge break, and we do think of this as a revolutionary moment, the end of history, and so on and so forth, which Robert Meister talks about, and he says that the fact that our demands are so small, our demands for equality and justice are so small, prolonged this time, we're constantly waiting, in a state of waiting, we're waiting for our demands, we're waiting for all of these things. Well, maybe we should actually think about a break, actually think about an event, not necessarily about what happens after, like anarchists. They want a big event, they want the fall of the state, but they're not getting an alternative system that will come after that. And they're still taken more or less seriously in some circles.
Just very quickly, a lot of anarchist temporality is based on the idea that the revolution is now and so the future is in the present. So I actually read what you were saying as being more in line with a lot of anarchist activism and thought. You don't have a messianic temporality. You begin making the new world in the shell of the old. But you want to, it might be our last comment because then we can take a break because it just started raining.
I don't know whether I should start this because I feel like I'm opening a can of worms here. Because, but that's what I like what you said about what capitalism is. It's a self-destructive system, but it continually revamp itself and regroup but with the old ideas. And like the communism, when you said that, I would say, really, did communism actually, was that a real fall of communism? Or is it reappear itself behind the capitalism? In a sense, look at Russia at the moment, and look at the United States at the moment. What is it hidden in there between capitalism and communism, and also imperialism? So, and the other point I would like to take is when you talk about individual, we have to start where our individual is. Where we are, which is, I felt in the school, in the university system, I felt as an individual, I am trapped in this capital concept that is everywhere. We're not talking about just money, we're not talking about, but you talk about the concept of corporation within university level. So we are talking if I take a very concrete example with university professors. They have a system of points that is very widespread. So you have you have to run after it, and so it keeps you into the system. You have to write certain number of articles, have to be published certain places, and then in order to earn the points to get the money to lift yourself up the ladder of university levels. And how do you get your article published is how you need to follow the rules of the journals or the books that you publish in order to be able to sell. So the capitalist concept is so in-depth in so many levels that so many individuals, including myself, in order to get a job, how do you navigate this system, capitalist system, in order to be a part of it, to fight within it or outside of it.
That's a great point to conclude on then, because we have some wine coming shortly, and I think the wine will help us solve that problem.